So now I'd like to introduce our other John, Dr. John Besley, who has published extensively on science communication and public engagement. His work includes research on both public opinion about science and science communicators' views about public engagement. He recently published his book, Strategic Science Communication, with Anthony Dudo through the Johns Hopkins University Press. And can I just say that this book is absolutely incredible. I don't mean to shamelessly plug, but I'm going to shamelessly plug. It's a wonderful resource for anybody who's thinking about doing science communication or who has been doing it for decades. So I really suggest it. Anyway, the book provides guidance on evidence-based approaches to being a more effective science communicator. And he's also the associate editor for risk communication for the journal Risk Analysis, and on the editorial boards of the Public Understanding of Science, Science Communication, Environmental Communication, and the Journal of Science Communication, and the International Journal of Science Education Research, Part B, Communication and Public Engagement. So John, please take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you, Jon and Pedro, for inviting me to join this. I'm really happy to be here with you, everyone, today, and I'm excited to talk about this stuff. I'm going to talk in the context of this book that came out about a year ago with my colleague Anthony Dudo. It's underlying that, so I was an advisor on the GlobalSCAPE process, but also one of the things that I love doing the most and that I get to do more and more often is I've worked with John, I've worked with Kelly, trying to help think about, I'm trying to understand how practitioners are thinking about communication, integrate that into my research, try to do better research that better serves the community, but also provide some, I've really gotten into there's so much good research that I wish we could get the science communication practitioner community to consider drawing on. And so what I'm going to talk about today is some of the advice that I've shared with Kelly and John, and also that underlies the book. So I'm going to do that. I got about 20 minutes of doing that. Hopefully it won't be too painful. And I'm just, yep. And so and so I'm going to talk a lot about goals. I'm going to talk about strategy more generally, but I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about goals because I think it's core to everything. So to start with my goal. So my goal, today we're not going to make you into like, I can't cover the whole book and all the stuff that I would love for you to do, but I will say that my vision for why we do this work with Anthony is that we're trying to we think our goal is really fundamentally about a trust goal, which is trying to get people to turn to experts in all our communities when faced with challenging societal questions, particularly scientific experts. That happens to be the group that I'm trying to advance. Today, my goal is not to do everything, but just really thinking about, I'm going to introduce or talk a little bit about how we differentiate a few different concepts. And I would love if practitioners, I'm going to my goal is almost to get you guys to start think about seeking out information in these contexts if this resonates with you, if this sort of way of thinking resonates with how you want to do science communication. And then also and this is really important to goals, I have a goal for myself, which is I'm always trying to figure out how to do better research, to do research that's more useful, as well as how to share my research, the research that I am doing better. So I have goals for myself too. I want to change my own behavior. And I will say underlying this, Anthony and I and other colleagues, we've done tons of research over the years. We've probably surveyed about 30,000 scientists, mostly for my context in North America. We've done interviews, similarly, hundreds of hours of interviews with scientists, with trainers, with scientific societies, fellowship programs, science philanthropies. We really are out there all the time. I do work on how to foster trustworthiness research, but I'm also doing this research trying to understand how scientists are thinking about communication with the goal of trying to help make it a little bit more strategic. And what I'm really going to, my understand is my mandate today is I'm going to suggest really 4 sets of concepts that I think would be really 4 really theoretical areas or concepts that I would love for, if you're interested in them, you want to take that next step into being a more evidence-based strategic science communicator, that you consider these areas as places that you might want to dive into. There's a couple other ones that are in the book that we're not going to really talk about around emotions and framing. I'm going to really focus on these top four today, and to some extent. And so I want to start by talking about strategy. And I'll say, so fundamentally, one of the weird things that happened to me was about 10 years ago. I found myself as a public relations professor. Before that, I was just a communication professor. And it turns out to have really shaped how I think about communication, in that I like this idea of really thinking about what are my audience-specific behavioral goals, what cognitive and affective objectives make those goals more likely, and then what tactics can I do to do that? And we'll sometimes people look at that and think, well, that sounds very one way, but I'll talk a little bit about how that doesn't have to be one way. And so just, I'm going to sort of defend myself. I don't know if I need to defend this idea of why we use the language of strategy, but I love it's a fun thing if you get a chance to do a deep dive into the world of just books on strategy, whether it's corporate strategy or a lot of the books, it turns out, are written in the context of military strategy. There's not as much communication strategy book that in the way that I think is that I want us to think about it. But fundamentally, it's when you think about strategy, we're always thinking, what real world thing am I trying to achieve? What real world impact? Not just what do I achieve, but also there's this question of efficiency. We're in the science communication space. I wish there was more money, more resources for us. We're working on it, but it's not. And so it's not just about how do we communicate, but how do we use the resources we have as effectively and efficiently as we can. And fundamentally, one of the things we've learned from a lot of talking to scientists and trainers is so much of our training is about skills. How can I speak more clearly? How can I tell an effective story? But those things only matter if we're telling the story that has the effect we want, if we're saying speaking clearly about the right thing. And so it's not just about choosing the sources, but choosing the sources to help us achieve a goal. And so part of this is like, we got to move in our discussions beyond talking about tactics and get to why are we doing tactics. And the other thing is this, I love the language of I'm a social scientist. I love the language of social scientists. This is probably a little bit of, I think there's Top Chef in various countries, but some version of cooking shows. This is one of my favorite cooking shows. And then one of the things I love about it is there's this task where you have to can you tell the difference between peach and a plum? Or can you tell the difference between Thai basil and Italian basil? And this idea of if you're really getting into something, if you really want to talk about yourself want to think about yourself as being a sophisticated expert, the concepts really start to matter, and really pushing ourselves to be really clear about the concepts that we care about. Now, in the social sciences, one of the things, the pain in the butt, is there are concepts that have many names. And so one of the things is moving beyond the top level name to really get into how is this defined, how is this measured, is really important if we're going to do this well. And so I'm going to jump into goals. I'm going to start about my favorite thing to talk about these days is, and both at a conceptual level, at PCS. I'm in the Netherlands today because we're going to be at PCST this week. One of the papers I'm going to talk about is some research on scientists' goals. I love talking about goals right now. But fundamentally, the thing that I think is a little different, and the thing that I push John and I probably talk about, John C. and I probably talk about the most, is that a goal or is that an objective? And so for me, it's really important to think as audience-specific behavioral goals. And so some of them are really easy. Do I want a kid from a specific community that's maybe underserviced, that's been ignored and treated badly? Do I want them to choose the science career? Do I want a policymaker to consider evidence from a specific research organization or a specific type of research? Maybe it's voting, maybe it's donating, maybe it's, do I want a person to install a solar panel on their house? Do I want them to, or some sort of more energy efficient thing? Sometimes there's a nice, clear behavior. Not always, but sometimes, and if there is, I mean, that's great. We're off to a good start. But that's often one way of thinking about goals. I think another really important thing in our space, sometimes our goal is that we want people to not oppose something. We want people to accept a decision like, okay, I don't love it, but it looks like there was a good scientific process followed. I can accept it. That's the idea. That's a legitimate decision. Ultimately, when we can talk about behavioral trust. The language of trust is really tricky. But one aspect of trust is the behavior of trust, which ultimately means yeah, I'm not sure, I'm uncertain, but I trust these people, so I'm making myself vulnerable. And so often when we think about what I want, even if I want policymakers to fund science, they're giving up, they're asking society to give up resources because they trust it's going to be used well. They could have used those resources for something else. And so almost all the science communication groups I work with have at least some goals that are involved, like, well, need to make sure we have long-term relationships of trust. Now, a funny thing, remember I said that we're going to make sure that we talk about this in a two-way context. One of the things that I often have to push scientists on is, well, what goal do you, what behavior of yours are you eager to change? Are you willing to change? And so thinking about, you can design communication, you can have a goal of, I want to do better research, or I want to do research in a better way. Or if you think about the trust side of it, I want to figure out who I can trust to do research with or in collaboration with. And so we can have what do we mean by really good consultation, for example? We mean that I've consulted and then I've changed my plan to be better. That's what good consulting is. And so when I think of two-way goals, I think if I have goals, yeah, I want these people to consider this thing. I also have a goal for myself, which is I want to change how I want to be open at least to changing what I do. And so that's what I really mean by goals. And practically where this comes up is I have these conversations all the time. Sometimes with John, who's sitting next to me here, maybe can't see him right now. I go, well, what's your goal? Well, we want to decrease misinformation about X, Y, or Z. And I have to say, cool. Well, why do you want to decrease misinformation? What do you think is going to happen in the real world if you were to increase the correct information that people have? Or someone said, well, sometimes if we're working with physicists or astrophysicists, we're in Leiden at the big cool telescope building, and at the observatory, sorry, not Pedro's like laughing, at the cool telescope building. Maybe like I get astrophysicists say, oh, I want people to experience awe and wonder. And awe and wonder is great. I don't think anyone's against awe and wonder, but I still have to push. Okay, cool. People experience awe and wonder, and then what do they do? Like, why do you want people to do awe and wonder? And maybe it's about, yeah, like as a kid, they experienced awe and wondered, and it made them seek out more information about science, and maybe that's what led them into a science career. And so we can talk about, oh, your goal is kids choose a science career, and awe and wonder, and then this becomes the key part. Awe and wonder might be one part of that, but let's think about other, what I'll call objectives in a second, might lead us there. Or I want to see that scientists are human. Oh, well, what do you mean by human? Well, I mean, whatever it is people mean by human. And so, well, why do you want people to see scientists as human? Well, because I want them to turn to, again, this is where that's the trust. I want people to turn to scientists. And then you have a hypothesis that says, well, I think if people saw scientists in a specific way, they'd be more likely to turn to them. And so good, we can say, okay, you have a trust goal, and you have this hypothesis that perceiving scientists as sharing your values or as human are going to make that trust more likely, showing the shared values. Yeah, and so that's I can't emphasize it. Like, that's probably the conversation I have the most often, is really pushing scientists like, no, but why do you want that to happen? And I encourage you to push yourself on that all the time. Now, there's some other contexts in the strategy book. That's like one, we talk about goals in every chapter, but we also do it with one of the beginning chapters of really thinking about pushing people on the goals thing. And we know from lots of surveys, if you push scientists, eventually they'll get to their goals, which is also an ethical thing, right? So we can't pretend we don't have goals, because we do. We're not just communicating often. Maybe there are people who are just communicating for the sake of communicating, but often there's something underlying there. And I think we need to be, an ethical part of communication is being open about that. So there's another important thing in science, of course, with tactics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time tactics, but I will note, as I said at the beginning, that so much of our discussions in science communication training is about how to do tactics better, which is absolutely important. We need to be good tacticians, but we should be choosing our tactics because they're connected to our goals. And we can think about, and also we should think about tactics, not just in terms of what do you say, but how do you say it, who says it, where do you say it, when do you say it, things like how you dress, how you set up a room, how you set up a whole engagement stuff, those things really, really matter too. But really what I think is really neat, the thing that the book is about, and the thing that, because I'm ultimately also a trust researcher, objectives to me, if you really want to become a sophisticated, evidence-based strategic communicator, we really need to think hard about not just what happens in the world and what we do in terms of communication, but this is like the beliefs, feelings, frames, BFFs, like fun things, fun acronyms, best friends forever, but beliefs, feelings, frames, those objectives that happen in the middle. And before I say something about objectives, I have to do this other, I promise, 4 types of theory. It's really important to think about what we mean by engagement. And then, so where I think about engagement, sometimes we think engagement means dialogue. And I would argue that engagement, dialogue is a tactic. It's a thing we do to get a thing, so that something else happens. So that, and the thing that I think in dialogue is really special about, same thing with storytelling, same thing with clear language, is it enables people to, and these are all books that about this idea of fast versus slow thinking. But the thing that I think is really key about engagement, this idea of engagement, is that if we give people the motivation and opportunity to attend, to pay attention to something, to really, that something's interesting and it's at the right level and it's focused in the right way, it means that people are able to pay attention. People are able to pay attention. What happens is they perceive things in certain ways, and when we perceive things, we form beliefs. And so this is where the book, people sometimes get a little fussy about our use of the word beliefs, but fundamentally, there's so many things that we think about in terms of beliefs. And I don't mean belief in God. I mean, I believe that scientists are honest. I believe that scientists are caring. I believe that there's a benefit from this behavior, which I'll talk about in a second. But those beliefs form when people have the chance to attend, to pay attention. And ultimately, the other thing about our communication, our interest in the book and how we think about communication is I'm not interested in any one event. There's no one event or one communication activity that's going to make a big change. It's about cumulative, long-term impact. A lot of these books on fast, I think, like, how do I get somebody to not buy a chocolate bar at the checkout counter? But the things that we're interested in, I think, if we want long-term trust in science, if we want people, policymakers and citizens to turn to use scientific evidence when making decisions in their lives, those require these sort of the development of long-term beliefs, which is really about, when I think of beliefs, I think all the different beliefs that I'm going to talk about these things. Now, often one of the things we do in science communication is we spend a lot of time talking about what we shouldn't do. We say we shouldn't do a deficit model. We shouldn't just try to give people scientific facts, which is to say correct, true beliefs about the world, which is not, we shouldn't just try to communicate scientific knowledge, because we know that just communicating scientific facts doesn't do it. And that's true. And so, yes, we shouldn't do that. That being said, sharing knowledge is good. It's why people invite us into let us build museums and let us invite us to give talks. It's good to share your knowledge. So it's always going to be a potential communication objective. You want people to believe that the Earth goes around the sun. You want people to believe that carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere. Those are things that you want people to believe because they're true, which is to say have that knowledge. But the key for us is that that's just one, it's not that that's a bad objective, it's just one objective. It's just one cognitive objective. There's also, so I also don't talk about, because it's, I also make a big point of, I almost try not to say communicating science. I say things like communicating in the context of science, because there's going to be so many other beliefs that are important when we're doing science communication. Fun thing about beliefs have immediate analogs in information. If I say, I want to communicate that scientists care about people like you, so that's a thing that I want you to believe. If I think of that as a belief, I can now start thinking about, well, what information could I share about scientists' motives? If I want people to believe that scientists have integrity, let's assume, I have warmth there twice, it should be integrity, honesty, beliefs. But if I want people to believe that scientists have integrity, are honest, and let's assume from an ethical perspective that we can't communicate this if it's not true, then there's types of information that I might want to share. And we know, and so this is another model that I'd love people to dive into, which is integrative model of organizational trust, but I also put in some procedural fairness theory and some social identity theory. There's a set of 5 beliefs here that those are like ingredients that if you want people to trust you, those are things you may need to communicate. They may need to take, if you have 60 minutes or 600 words, you may need to take 50 words or 5 minutes to communicate why people should trust you, because you are trustworthy. And so those ability, benevolence, integrity are sometimes called trustworthiness versus trust, which is the behavior. So that's 7 ingredients. Another set of ingredients that you might consider communicating, you're not just communicating, here's what I know, you're communicating maybe beliefs about this is a risk, or here's a risk, or here's a benefit. And it might be a risk like, this is going to make you feel bad, it's going to make you satisfied, or maybe it's an instrumental risk. It's going to be helpful, it's going to be useful. We have normative beliefs, which is like other people are doing it, or injunctive normative beliefs. Other people think you should do it. Sometimes that really matters. We know we've done research on kids choosing science careers. They're more likely to choose science careers if they think people like them expect them or expect them to choose such careers, or commonly choose such careers. So we might not just communicate the benefits of a science career. Maybe we communicate that science careers are kind of normal for somebody like you. As self-efficacy beliefs, not only am I communicating that a science career might be lucrative, but also that you have the ability to do it. Those are also beliefs that we could do. And the fun thing about being really cool about objectives is like, how do we build trust? Well, that's really hard. That's a big question. But how can we foster perceptions of benevolence, caring, goodwill, in the context of this specific project we're doing? That's a much more concrete discussion. And now we can really get into these discussions of tactics. Another fun thing we can take, we sometimes call this the GOT, goals, objective, tactics. And if we follow it out, we can also call it GOTOG, which is a terrible acronym, but it's fun to say. You can use objectives especially, and goals to some extent, but the goals are really hard. Remember, we said goals happen cumulatively over the long term. Those are going to be really hard to track. But after any event, I can say, did this scientist seem caring? Did this scientist seem honest? Did this scientist seem smart and intelligent and skilled? And I can say, do you think that there's benefits from the thing they were recommending, or risks from the thing they were recommending? I can use objectives because they're beliefs or perceptions before their beliefs for evaluation for any type of event, which I think is pretty fun. And yeah, so I mean, my point today is, I understand all of us want to be more strategic science, more evidence-based communicators. That was 4 sort of theory-related concepts that I'd love for you to consider and drive into. Ultimately, I want you to push yourself to be concrete about goals and objectives, and then also push social scientists to provide research that can help you be a better communicator. And I will stop there. Thank you so much for letting me share that, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. I really appreciate hearing all of that information. I think the way that you frame it is really fascinating.